I was away on retreat last week, so I missed the week on the Psalms with Avery.
Was good.
Yeah, I was sorry to miss it because it's a beautiful part of our scripture. But here we go. We're leaving the Old Testament and we're beginning the New this week, and starting with the mystery of the Incarnation. So a first thing to note, I think, right at the beginning would, to say kind of how do we know about the Incarnation, or how do we know about God becoming man? This is not the kind of thing that you would wake up one morning and say, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense," right? Nobody had this idea. There were, of course, before Jesus, ideas of human beings having divine power, of even being gods, but they were always kind of, more like the Greek gods. They were more actually like divinized human beings. Kind of it's like a lot of those stories of the Greek gods read more like soap operas than anything. And there was really not, you had this philosophical development happening within the Hebrew and the Greek worlds within the Hebrew world of Yahweh, who is the creator, right? I am who am. Yeah. So and his ways are as far above our ways as the heavens are above the earth. So this idea of just this God who's shrouded in mystery and who's so omnipotent and beyond our ability to comprehend. And even within the Greek philosophical tradition, the God that Plato, for example, and Aristotle spoke of, the unmoved mover, who would be a very remote and distant God, unchanging, outside of time and space, right? The origin of all things. The idea that God in that, like this kind of robust way, not a projection of our own selves, but as the God who is the foundation of all time and space, taking on human form. People didn't come up with that idea. Like, that's not something that people just like woke up one morning and thought about. So how do we know about it? And I think ultimately, as we've talked about in these last weeks, it's through tradition, right? So because people 2,000 years ago, strange things started happening, and they experienced what was really beyond their wildest imaginations, and they recounted what had happened, and those accounts ended up eventually being written down. So we have, of course, the four Gospels, right, are really the account of Christ. And of the four, there are two that have what we call the infancy narratives, as you read in Pope Benedict's the excerpts from his book. So Matthew and Luke, right, are the two Gospels that speak about the birth of Christ. But even those two Gospels are are pretty different in terms of what they relate. Now, we read Luke, we didn't read Matthew. Hopefully you remember Matthew. And then Pope Benedict did go over Matthew somewhat as well in the book, the excerpts that you may have taken a look at. Within Matthew, his gospel begins with the genealogy, right? And then showing how, kind of outlining these. He wants to show the connection between Abraham, David, and then Christ, right? So it begins with the genealogy, and then he focuses in Matthew. If you're trying to remember where you see what, Matthew's the one that has all the stuff about Joseph. Matthew tells us Joseph's story, right? So in Matthew's gospel, now interesting when you think about it. It's like, who told Matthew about this? Like, you wonder, like, maybe Joseph had a really good friend. It was like his carpentry buddy. Or maybe Mary. But Luke takes a lot more from Our Lady, right? So you wonder kind of like, what was Matthew's source on this? I don't know. But somehow this whole thing of Joseph's dreams, right? Like, so somehow and you'd think this is a guy, we don't have anything he wrote or said, right? This is he's kind of a quiet saint. Not kind of, he is a quiet saint. And so he must have told somebody about it. And then also in Matthew's gospel, we have the story of the Magi, the travelers from the east. And we have the story, this flight into Egypt, the slaughtering of the infants and the flight into Egypt. So that's all within Matthew's gospel. Luke's gospel, on the other hand, we begin with the story of Zechariah and his carrying out his priestly duties in the temple, and then the whole episode with him being, because of his lack of faith, being mute, struck dumb for months. And then we have the Annunciation. So this Luke's gospel, of course, is where we get a lot of just the beautiful texts around Christmas, right? Fiat, right? Be it done unto me according to your word. That's Luke, right? That's where we hear about this. And we have the story of Our Lady's visit to Elizabeth and the beautiful hymn, the Magnificat. Luke's, these infancy narratives, so they are the bookends for our prayer each day in the church. The Benedictus is the beginning of the day, right? Zechariah's prayer of thanksgiving, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who's come to his people and set them free. And then Mary's prayer, the Magnificat at the end of the day, at evening prayer. So these are two beautiful hymns that are given to us by Luke. And we're not really sure how they came about, how they came to be incorporated within the gospel. It's how, I don't know how much. Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of these things where there was clearly some theological reflection happening with the gospel writers as they were recounting what happened, and you wonder if some of these, it's anonymous, right? I mean, some of these two hymns, we have no idea kind of where they came from. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I don't think anybody really thought, like, that somebody was sitting there when Mary visited Elizabeth and was like sitting there going, okay, she's just, my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. Like, so, it's not, this isn't the kind of thing where you have someone like literally sitting there recording what, this is not, it's way before live streaming. But at the same time, this came from a Christian community that was reflecting on this moment and saying, here, Our Lady is coming to greet her cousin in this really profound encounter. And St. John the Baptist, leaping in her womb, Elizabeth's womb. And so then this kind of like, you wonder, like, but these are beautiful hymns, huh? Mark's gospel begins with the preaching of John the Baptist. So he kind of just, who knows? Maybe he said, well, other people got it. I don't need to go there. Or maybe he didn't really have any good sources on it. Who knows? John's gospel is really, John's gospel is much more reflective, right? John's gospel is written, we're pretty sure it was written a fair amount later, maybe even a generation after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it could have been it depends on who you talk with. Could have been written in 90s, even up to 110 AD. So whereas the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we think were probably written, I think most scholars would say sometimes 60 to 80, somewhere around there, right? So, of course, Jesus dies in around 40. And so between 20 and 40 years after his death, the first Gospels are written down. And then John, of course, would have been the young, he's the young guy. So, but as John, and then John, of course, also being the one who Jesus entrusted Mary to. So John's the one that we're, like, if anybody's going to kind of have an ear to what Our Lady is thinking and reflecting about, it's going to be John. And I think that's where John had time to digest these things and to chew on them and to pray about them and to really think about them. So John, we hear from right at the beginning, right? You're all very familiar, I imagine, but in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him. Without him, nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It's very evocative of Genesis, isn't it? Right? And that's, so John's a big picture guy, right? If Mark and if Luke, they're kind of down in the nitty-gritty. John's at 30,000 feet, kind of. That's why he's depicted as the eagle, symbolically, right? John's the one who's really reflecting and praying and thinking about these things. So this is kind of how we have this experience, and as the first Christians, you think about, of course, Jesus' divinity did not become apparent to them right away. Was it brought up here? I got like RCIA presentations in my head and like all kinds of other stuff. So if I repeat something we've already said in this class, forgive me. But and I forget where that. Anyway, it's a theme. But they first knew Jesus as like a guy, right? They first encountered him as a human being. And you think about it, the first 30 years of his life. Now there's some strange things that happened around his birth, but ultimately then it says he went home. After 12, he went home and he was obedient to his parents. And he kind of just lived a normal life, right? And so we really don't, and even after he began to recruit the apostles and there was a lot of confusion about who he was, what he was doing, all these things. So, and even the apostles and the disciples, when he was arrested, when he was crucified, they still didn't really, right? They didn't expect him to rise from the dead. There was a lot of confusion about who he was. And even, when Peter said, "You are the Christ," he says, "Who do you say?" He's like, "Well, you wouldn't have come to that on your own. That's not mere flesh and blood that would have told you that. That's a gift from God. That's inspiration that would have told you that." So Jesus doesn't presume that his disciples or anybody really would understand who he is. And I think that becomes, it's interesting, right? Pope Benedict in the excerpt you read, he takes from it's an interesting tie, isn't it? Where he goes from the Incarnation, he goes right to Pontius Pilate's question, right? And he said, Pilate's question, like, "Where are you from?" Like, right? And so, and this is a question that Pope Benedict really kind of then goes through, and it's echoed throughout Jesus' time, right? Who do you say that I am? Where are you from? What are you doing around? Like, what are you doing? Who do you say that I am? And and Pope Benedict says the four Gospels are really written to answer this question, right? He says that's what the Gospels are written to do, to answer the question of where are you from? Why are you here? What are you doing? Who are you? So, in terms of, I don't know if you picked up on it, in terms of the, why did God become man? Right? Which is, Cur Deus Homo is St. Anselm's essay here, so that's the translation of that. Why did God become man? So the Catechism gives us 4 reasons. I don't know if you saw that, right? So the Catechism on paragraphs 457, 458, 459, and 460, you have basically, you can see they're kind of italicized. Right? So the Catechism is giving us these kind of 4 major reasons. So the first being, in order to save us by reconciling us to God, right? The second, so that or to reveal God's love, right? So we can know God's love for us. Or we might just to say, even generally, to reveal God, because God is love, right? The third being to be our model of holiness. So we might say kind of to show us how to live. And here, see. Should ask Mike if I'm getting this in the video thing, but and then the fourth being to make us partakers in divine life, right? So my thought is to kind of try and walk through these four with you a little bit and tag the readings. Let's see if I can do it. But to try and kind of bring the readings in, looking kind of at this structure, and then to do some exploration after that. So, the first, to save and reconcile us to himself, right? And this, so Athanasius' reading, on the Incarnation, really kind of zeroes in on this whole question of why did God, why did he have to become man? And so it's one of the areas kind of where he begins. He says, this was really, I don't know if you caught, he's like, this is a tragedy. Like God makes human beings in his image and likeness. He extends his divine life to us, and then it gets screwed up, right? So, God made man for incorruption as an image of his own eternity, he says, but through the envy of the devil, death entered the world and was everywhere prevailing. And I don't know if you caught how he was, sometimes I think we think of like the fall, and then it's like, oh, we're getting ready. We're kind of like we fell and now we're getting up. And then finally, okay, we're kind of getting along, and then Jesus comes along, and then Athanasius is like the fall, and then it's like, keep falling. Like Athanasius is like, I was like, the fall, and then he's like, well, God told you this was just going to basically mean you're doomed. You're doomed. And then everything after that was just doom. Like he says basically, God's image was disappearing, and the handiwork of God was in the process of dissolution. For death gained from Genesis on, as God had said it would. So it wasn't just that we fell, but it was like you are on the path of destruction. Like you're not just like it's bad. Like this is not going anywhere good, right? So that's Athanasius pretty clear on that, right? When left to our own devices, rejecting God, and we talked about the serpent and all the other things a while back. When you start following the serpent, you're not going anywhere. Like there's no life in your future. So he says God could not allow this to stand, right? That a good and all-powerful God would not stand by and see his handiwork fade without intervening. And he said this would be unseemly, unworthy of God's goodness. That if he's God, to just watch this unfold and to be like, well, they deserve it. That's not who he is. It's not who God is. So, and also, he brings the dimension of his omnipotence. There's a kind of, to let the devil stand, right? To let this happen and not counter it in some way undermines his omnipotence. It's like if you allow an enemy to invade and you don't do anything, then you might say, well, you're not a very strong place, right? So God couldn't allow this kind of invasion. It's his image and likeness that's being, it's like the devil with every one of these things. You can just watch. He's like, yeah, I got Adam and Eve now. I'm going to get Cain and Abel. Now I'm going to go. You thought you were going to save people with Noah? Now I got him drunk, and look at what he did after that. And now look at the Tower of Babel. And now you pulled him through the Red Sea. He's just like, he's like, right? So there's this kind of like, a kind of, God can't just let that stand, right? Athanasius is kind of talking, like, God's not going to just be like, yeah, sure, I guess you win. So he intervenes. And I don't know if you caught it. It seemed like he didn't say it explicitly, but it seems like you could say, you really see the reasons for the intervention in Athanasius' writings kind of fall into two areas. The first, I would say that there are two. So one is, he's countering the two aspects of the fall. What does the fall introduce? Sin and death, right? And if you notice when Athanasius is talking about then what is Christ, what's his work do? He's coming to reverse sin and death. So, and did you catch his comparison, the analogy to the king, right? He says like, the first is he comes to show loving kindness upon us and to visit us. So he says, as a king fortifies and honors a city merely by his presence, so Christ fortifies us against the enemy through his presence with us. Like this idea that, this basically the human race is under attack, and by God as the king, kind of, you think about this as the analogy he's using. He's saying, just by showing up, like it, I thought about this recently with Israel, like right, in the whole Hamas and everything. Well, the president of the United States goes and visits Israel. Well, it's like, yeah, go try and attack it now. Now, does the president have any? The president is not a soldier, but the presence of somebody of great power and authority on the ground, right? It says like, you're not going to mess with you're not going to mess with this, or the consequences now have become, because you mess with this human race, you're messing with me, right? So this identification then, so when the king says, you're attacking this city of mine, and you think, oh, that's not. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna put my palace right there, and now you're gonna know you're not just attacking my city. If you're gonna attack my city, you're attacking me, right? So did you see that? That's kind of. So he's saying if this sin and death, he's saying now by Christ putting himself in that, he's saying sin and death, that's not just an attack on my people anymore. That's an attack on me. Right? So that's the first thing that Athanasius. The other theme, though, was interesting. He talks about it's not merely that we've been attacked by death, or by sin, but we are also complicit in it. We are rebels, right? So it's not just this poor city. This poor innocent city is being attacked by the devil. Poor human race. No, we're not merely victims of original sin. We're also carriers of it. And that means that we're not only abused by evil, but through deception we tend to ally ourselves with the abuser. Right? We are not only a land besieged, but also a land of rebellion. And so this is where Athanasius also speaks about then. So the king shows up. It's not just a signal to the forces attacking the city. It's also a signal to the residents of the city. It's like, I'm going to come I'm coming here. Now, I'm in the midst of all of you, so you better get yourselves in order, right? Because I'm not in some remote place. Now I'm in your midst. And so there's that sense of and also then you think about if you're in a city and you got this king and he's like, I don't know, some ocean over there. You're like, yeah, he's the king. Yeah, whatever. But then, like, the ship comes in, disembarks, the soldiers unload. All of a sudden, it's like, yeah, that's the king right here. He's at my doorstep. And then, so all of a sudden, it's like, oh, this is getting kind of real, right? You know, obedience to the king in a foreign land is a very different thing from obedience to a king on my doorstep, right? So I think, you know, you see that with Athanasius, this sense of these are these kind of two areas where Athanasius is talking about, why has God chosen to make his dwelling here among us? What's going on? But it's interesting too, he gets into, and this kind of moves into this second area. He also talks about how God manifests himself in the senses so that we can acknowledge his lordship and reject the false idolatries, the false kings, if you will. Because we've been, if you think about it again, he's using this analogy of the king a lot. But it's like we've been kind of following the warlords that have been kind of the demons, if you will, that are all the idols and everything else. That's kind of in our rebellion. We're constantly kind of following other forces. And so he's like, well, if they can see me, if I'm there, then we're going to be able to, we can reject those false authorities. They're revealed for what they are. It's the way that it happens. Like when the real king shows up, all of a sudden what happens? The other ones all go scurrying for the exits, right? Because the light of his actual rule, when he's not around, it's like, oh, we can deceive ourselves a little bit and think, oh, he's not really around. It's like, but when the king shows up, then you're like, okay, everybody else who was trying to be in charge, they're not in charge anymore, right? And he talks about how God comes to meet our senses halfway. I don't know if you caught that part where he's like, he's allowing our senses then. There's an acknowledgement that we need to actually be able to, our senses, our corporeal nature. It's not just our intellect or our souls, but our bodies need to be. We need his presence. We need him in our daily life. Like we need to be around him. So he meets our senses halfway. So I think that's where, we see some of I think some of the, the language of, and it's hard, right? So Athanasius, he would have written, I don't know what, he would have written in Greek, right? And then probably went through a Latin translation. The English translation we have is a little archaic. So it's not, but I think we're not used to necessarily the kind of writing and even reasoning of some of the, this is where every time I hear somebody be like, oh, those stupid people from way back then. It's like, have you read anything they wrote? Because they don't sound very stupid when you try and read what they wrote. So if we go to Saint Anselm, right? Now, did you catch? So he's got Bozo, right? You realize Bozo the clown comes from this, right? Yeah, Bozo the clown is from Bozo, who has been arguing, like that goes back 1,000 years. The reason we call the clown Bozo is because St. Anselm chose to have an argument with Bozo defending the Incarnation. So there you go. Every time you see Bozo the clown, you'll have a new appreciation for it. So Bozo. Now this is a whole nother, this, what's beautiful, so it's interesting too watching, so Anselm, this is of course a very, it goes back to kind of a Socratic dialogue, right? So he's like, and part of this is if you think about it, Anselm, if he was just writing this as an essay, he can't really bring up the major objections. But he puts it in the mouth of Bozo, and then Bozo can like really have at it, right? And you hear, Bozo's not going to hold back much, right? Bozo's going to be like, he's like, what does he say? If a man without motive should, by severe toil, do something which he could have done it an easy way, but he does it the hard way, why would you consider him to be a wise person? And it seems like this is a pretty difficult way to save humanity. So why would God do it this way? And furthermore, he says, how can God be good if he's punishing an innocent man for the sins of the guilty? Like, how is justice served by slaughtering an innocent man? Now, those are pretty serious questions, aren't they? So, Anselm, I don't know if you noticed this, he's like, okay, all right, well, let's just first acknowledge, like, God's not irrational. Like, that's the foundation here. God's not irrational. He has a reason for doing things. And he also says in the incarnation of God, there's no lowering of the deity, but it's the nature of man that's being exalted. So it's not, and so he starts to really go at this question of, did God did he want Jesus to die? Right? Did he send him into this earth to die? And he says, no. So he says, the Father did not compel him to suffer death or even allow him to be slain against his will. Right? And we think about that passage from John where Jesus says, no one can take my life from me. I lay it down and I'll take it back up again. It's not, no one takes, Christ's life is not taken from him. He lays it down. And so Jesus, and it's a tough, So Jesus was obedient to the point of death, not obedient to a command to die. The Father didn't say, I want you to die. The Father said, I want you to love me without compromise, completely and freely, and this is what Jesus was obedient to. The command to love, which is the same command Anselm makes the point of saying we all have, right? So God did not therefore compel Jesus to die, but Jesus suffered death of his own will, not yielding up his life as an act of obedience, but on account of his obedience in maintaining holiness. So in this fallen world, the command to love entails death, but death is not what God desires for anyone, much less for Christ. He desires for his Son and for us through him to obediently and completely give ourselves to him in freedom, to love him, right? And so he doesn't intervene to rescue Jesus from death without, he couldn't do that without undermining this love. The gift of self to the Father has to be freely and completely given by Christ, or else it's deficient. He says you just be a servant. And what do you remember? Jesus says you're not servants, I call you friends. Because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. So Christ's humanity can't just be kind of going along with this. And so Bozo at one point says, then why do we then commend Jesus and celebrate Jesus for obedience to the point of death? And Anselm says, well, he could have attained his exaltation by obedience that didn't, even that if it didn't entail his death. But death was how it was obtained. And then this beautiful sentence, for if we intend to do a thing, but mean to do something else first by means of which it may be done, when the first thing which we wish to do is done, if the result is such as we intended, it is properly said to be on account of the other, since that is now done which caused the delay, for it had been determined that the first thing should be done without the other. Did you catch that? We've become quite lazy in our thinking. And I don't know about you, but I sit there and read it, and I'm like, oh, it's been a while since I took some philosophy classes. I'm like, oh, okay. I told Avery, I was like, that's a sentence you got to map out. Like, you got to diagram that thing, right? But notice, he even seems to think it's a hard sentence to understand, because then he gives you two examples afterward. The example of crossing the river and the example of fasting before Mass. Right? So it's like he already seems to say, yeah, I get it. It's kind of a challenging concept. But what he's basically saying here, right, is that even though Christ's death is the way that his love was proven perfect, it's not his death that we celebrate, but his perfect love that was proven in death. Right? Death was the way that it was proven, but it's not the death that we celebrate. It's the love that was willing to persevere even to the point of death. And that's an important point. Why? Because God's not irrational. God would not do something wrong in order to accomplish a good thing. Ends don't justify means. God would not do something wrong even if the salvation of the human race. God doesn't do wrong. Right? So, that's why Anselm's at pains to show that that Christ, it was not ever the intention of God that Christ die. Like he didn't come here to die. He came here to love obediently, even to the point of death. But he never wanted death. Right? So that's just to kind of hit a couple. I mean, I think part of this, and I guess I would just say more generally about some of these readings, it's important for you, even if you look through some of these readings and you're like, what the heck is going on here? It's important on a couple of levels with both Athanasius and Anselm. First of all, these are two thinkers who had a significant impact on the development of theology. It's good for you to just have a sense of, part of it is there's some intellectual rigor here. And these are people who, like, the way that we now are thinking about, like, the DNA code, like the best and the brightest thinkers of the ancient world were thinking about the Incarnation. The people who were who now would be like going off to MIT and Harvard and all these places and just blowing everybody out of the water because they were so intelligent, those are the people who were reflecting on the hypostatic union. So it's a real concern now that we're not putting our intellectual resource. We're worried about, like, I don't know what. We worry about the most asinine things now. And we spend our mental and intellectual energy thinking about just absolutely trivial things. Whereas there was a time when the great minds of the world were reflecting on the nature of God. And it's important for us to know that, to have that understanding. Lest we think that the study of God is just something kind of unserious, and that there don't need to be distinctions made. So I think that's one of the reasons to look at these things. It's actually, I think, really good for things to kind of go over your head from time to time. Right? And hopefully, if you feel like your brain is stretching a little bit, I think I like that. I'm like, wow, that's really hard. I can't pick that up the first time reading through it. Good. Do you really want to only read things you can pick up the first time you read through it? Right? So it's good to stretch your brain a little bit. These are brain-stretching readings, no question. But I think it's good for us. It's important. I mean, you look at most reading now, it's like 5th grade level. Right? In our vocabulary, it just goes like this. So it's a challenge, but what the hope is that it's like it's good for us, right? So I would just say I appreciate your wading through it and you're struggling with it. And look, at a certain point you might have been like, okay, that's fine too, right? But at least it's like, yeah, you're aware that this exists. That's the first level of learning. It's like the first time you heard the Our Father, you didn't know what it meant, but you just became aware of it, and then your understanding increases over time. So I think that's part of this, is just so you get a sense of, like, there's some depth here. And even if we don't have the tools to really go in and dive into it, but we know it's there.
It exists.
It does. And I don't know about you, but I'm like, thank God there were people these things at this kind of depth. It's like, because I'm standing on their shoulders, right? So that gives me a sense of, like, I'm like, yeah, I think I can walk here. Because this was not just something some people just kind of threw together haphazardly or didn't think about or reflect on, right? So I think that's really important too. This is the one I really want to zero in on, and this is the one that has. This is the one that really is, if you want to this is what's kind of caused, and obviously to save and reconcile is related to make us sharers in divine life, because obviously this happens necessarily if we're sharing in divine life, right? Obviously then we don't have to worry about sin and death if we're sharing in divine life. But this is really where the rubber hits the road and where there's been a lot of challenge in terms of the theology. And I think, so I want to bring to you then, to make us partakers in divine life, I want to zero you in on, and I know, Giselle, you were at the RCIA one, so you recognize this, but.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the Son of God became man, so that we might become God. Is that how God?
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm about to talk about.
Oh, okay.
So I want to zero you in on this whole concept of the mirabile commercium. All right? Because I think everything if you get this, then you get the Incarnation. And you understand then why there was so much fighting about it. Because this is really the key. So, the mirabile commercium basically can be translated somewhat. Mirabile is miraculous, right? Commercium would be, you think of commerce. So commercium is exchange. But, I mean, the English doesn't really do it justice. But basically this idea that, and you see it in Leo's tome a lot, to a degree, although he's actually considering the two natures a little more separate. But this is you'll hear, for example, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus. Let us seek to be like Christ, because Christ also became like us, to become gods through him, since he himself through us became a man. He took the worst upon himself to make a gift of us the best. So this idea of, so here's another one. St. Augustine, Christmas morning homily. No greater grace than what has now shone upon us from God is the only Son of God has become the Son of Man, making sons and daughters of men, sons and daughters of God. For your sakes, the one who was the Son of God became the Son of Man, in order that you, who were the sons of men, might be turned into the sons and daughters of God. You were sons of men, and you have become sons and daughters of God. He has shared with us our ills, and he is going to give us his goods. In other words, he descended for us so that we can ascend to him. Right? God is with us in order that we may be with him. He who came down to us in order for us to be with him he's now at work drawing us to himself. So another way that this is spoken of is exitus. And then reditus. So God comes down to us so that we can make a return to him, right? This is this exchange. This is the mirabile commercium. So part of this then, there's a principle within the marvelous or miraculous exchange, which is, you can put it, that which is assumed is redeemed. And you can actually make this somewhat stark. Only. So, you want to bring, so everything, we're down here, we're distant, right? This is like original sin. So Jesus comes into, what is he? So this could be us, but you can put anything you want to here. This is the beautiful thing about the mirabile commercium. So Jesus takes upon himself a family. It becomes a holy family. Jesus takes upon himself suffering. It becomes sanctified. Jesus takes upon himself poverty. It becomes holy. It's like everything, it's like the Midas touch, right? Everything Jesus touches, he sanctifies. Because he is God. So this is where you get this. Now, here's the tension though. Because God, if he's perfect and unchanging, immutable, right? This is the high understanding of God that we have, right? The philosophical understanding of God, that he's lacking in nothing. Well, how can you change if you aren't lacking? Part of the definition of God has always been rationally that he had to be unchanging. If in his perfection, to be perfect means to not change, because there's nothing to change into other than what he is. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute. How does he accomplish this without changing? How does he bring our humanity, our fallen humanity, into his divinity without changing? And that's where we get this whole development of this is Christology, and this is where we start developing, this is what takes many ecumenical councils and a whole lot of fighting and arguing and going back and forth and a lot of work to try and sort out words like, for example, you might have heard like the hypostatic union. Right? The hypostatic union, or to talk about, or when we the creed. The creed is all written around trying to articulate and to avoid problems that get in the way. Because here's the issue. If this is not true God, then we compromise this side, right? If it's not really God coming down, then we got a problem. On the other hand, if it's not really man going up, we got a problem. We need God to come all the way down here, and we need man to go all the way up here. And you see in the fighting here is that there's a conflict of saying, if you embrace this idea about who Jesus is, then you're compromising his divinity or you're compromising his humanity. And if you compromise his humanity or his divinity, then you compromise this. You compromise our salvation. And so that's where the arguments are with regard to Christ's nature, who he is. Who do you say that I am? That's where it gets, because this needs to work, right? They knew that this is why he came. He came to save us. And they knew he could only save us if it was really God and really man. Truly God and truly, and then it's like, how do we try and get our heads around that? Right? So, let's take a break. So, it gets, I think this is really what you want to, from my perspective, before you had any of the theological development or articulation or the philosophical categories and language to try and describe the Incarnation, I think we always had this understanding, this idea that, as St. Paul says, though he was not in the form of God, Jesus deemed equality with God something, did not deem equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, took the form of a slave, being born in the image and likeness of man. Right? And why did he do that? Because then God exalted him, and not just him, but all of us who are joined to him share in that exaltation. Right? So Christ, it's the word sometimes that's translated into English condescension, but it's not. It's not that we use the word condescension like negatively, but to descend with us, to condescend, to follow us to the depths, so Christ condescends. He comes into the depths so that he can raise us up to new life, right? So this is the whole, and Jesus, this is what Jesus said he was doing, and this is what he did. Right? And so then there's been a lot of work to try and understand intellectually and try and figure out how God, who is immutable, all-powerful, all-knowing, could do that. And that's really Christology. Like if you want to look at what's the study of the field of Christology, is how does God, as we know him, accomplish this. So, as there are some technical terms that came to be used that were borrowed from Greek philosophy. I don't want to get into them too much, but essence, substance, nature, person. So the ousia, hypostasis, physis, prosopon, all these kinds of things. They were not. If you look at the early years of trying to understand Jesus, there wasn't always a lot of clarity on what these words even related to exactly, and so sometimes some of the debates. Especially when you started looking at debates between Latin and Greek speakers, they were translating words, and it was hard It's always hard to know if you're getting an exact translation, right? When you're dealing with technical kinds of philosophical terminology. So there's a lot of back and forth trying to make distinctions about true, how does God enter into everything, and how do human beings enter into the Godhead? How does the divinity and the humanity connect here? Right? How does that work? So what's interesting is that I think fundamentally I would say this is a mystery. As much as we have gained some clarity around it, if you were to look at if I were to try and illustrate kind of this whole, it's like sometimes we have this idea that, and I guess just maybe to help visualize, sometimes we might think of like, here's the truth, right? And so here's faith, right? And faith is always seeking the truth, right? Or understanding. So we're always trying to see, we're trying to move in this direction. And the challenge is that we are led along this direction, but we can't. Our vision is not quite good enough, so the truth is a little bit murky, right? As St. Paul says, it's behind a mirror darkly. So we're kind of like, well, it's kind of in this area, right? And there's a bit of a vagueness because we have a general. So what you find often with doctrine is that then somebody's over here and they say, no, actually it's there. Right? Then the church comes along and is like, anathema, sit. Like, no, you're wrong. This is not the direction. Oh, it's over here. Nope, that's not the direction. So if you look at, as you're going through time, right, we're kind of, there's a vague kind of general direction, but then you have these people, and then the church is like, nope, 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 nope. And we call these heresies. And well, all that heresy means is error. Right? And so the heresies are when we say, no, you're trying to take us off course. Now, do we know exactly for sure it's exactly this point right here? No. Right? We can't see that clearly. So that's why it's a mystery. Right? It's a mystery. The truth is somewhere over here. But we can know that it's not over here. Or over here somewhere. Right? And so that's, I think, as you look at kind of the development of our the creed and the way that we understand Jesus, it's not so much that everyone's like, it's not like the bishops sat down and said, okay, we have these scriptures, we had this experience of Jesus, now let's write a theological treatise about how Jesus is God and how he is man. Let's write it all down. And let's put together a commission and we'll have our best theologians come up with their ideas. No, what basically happened was somebody, namely Arius or Marcion, comes along and Arius says, well, he's not actually God from all eternity. Jesus, the Logos, he was actually created by the Father. He is a demigod, but he's not. Because he can't be the true God because the true God's unchanging. So he's not really. We shouldn't say that he's the same God as God the Father, God of the Old Testament. He's not really. He's a different. He's able to change. He's able to live in time. That's why he came into this world. So Jesus isn't God from God. He's not light from light. He's not true God from true God. He's not begotten. He's made. Right? This is what Arius says. And Arius is a priest and he has followers. And so the bishops are sitting there going, what do we do with this? Because you can understand, they're saying, wait a minute, how does God, if it wasn't really God who ended up entering into sin and death, now Arius has compromised our salvation. right? And so they say, we need to talk, Arius. And they start, and there's right there. So there's Marcion says, well, actually he was God. He was the eternal Logos, God, but he didn't really become man. He just looked like it. So Docetism is where Marcion, and actually Docetism was the first kind of heretical belief. So from Dokain, Dokain is to seem, to appear. He appeared to be human, but he wasn't really human because God couldn't have become really human. Again, he's unchanging, and besides, we're really like messy creatures and everything else, and God's in the eternal celestial heights. So he just looked like he was suffering and dying, but obviously God wouldn't really die or suffer. How could God die? That doesn't make any sense. It couldn't have been God. It was just, it looked like God. But then you got a problem here, right? Because if it wasn't really God, then exactly what body was ascended and went into heaven? What humanity was divinized? Something that kind of looked like humanity, but wasn't really humanity, went to heaven. Well, so how does that help you and me? Because this last time I checked, this is pretty real humanity. And if God only entered into what looked like humanity, then how can my salvation be anything other than what looks like salvation? And so the fathers are like, no, you're compromising our salvation again. But these thinkers, part of it is they struggled with this idea that philosophically, right? How could a perfect God really become fully human? Right? Or how can a full human being really be God? Adoptionism. Some of the early churches, the idea was Jesus was human, and then at the baptism in the Jordan, when the Spirit hovered above the waters, that's when he became divine. He was adopted, but he wasn't divine before that. We had also Apollinarianism, which was Apollinarius, who was a bishop, proposed in answer to Arius, right? He said the Word assumed a human body in Jesus and thus replaced his human soul and mind. So Jesus had a human body, but his soul and his mind were divine. What's the problem there? Again, whatever is not assumed is not redeemed. If the human mind is not assumed into the divine nature of God, the human mind is not redeemed. If the human soul is not assumed into the Godhead, the human soul is not redeemed. So, nope. Sorry. Nestorianism, he didn't like the term. That was, now, why every year we celebrate the feast and we take it all for granted. We're like, oh yeah, first Sunday after Christmas, or it's not the first Sunday, it's the 1st of January, Feast of Mary, Mother of God. Yeah, sure, Mary's the Mother of God. That was a big debate. Because they're like, Nestorius is like, absolutely, Theotokos is the Greek for that. Theotokos, Mother of God. And he's like absolutely uncomfortable with that. He's like, how can you say that Mary's the mother of God? That makes absolutely no sense. She's the mother of Christ. She's the mother of Jesus. She's not the mother of God. That's crazy. Big fights. Right? And there, again, it's like, no. The church says again, no. If you're compromising what was in her womb, this was not just a man. It wasn't just you can truly say that the life in the womb of Mary was the life of God. That she is really the mother of God. So then you look again. So the response to Eutyches in the tome of Leo, he's a monophysite. So he claimed that Jesus had one nature, in essence, that, and there were different forms of monophysitism. So the idea was that you either got the divine nature kind of overshadows and replaces the human nature, or the divine and the human natures kind of meld into a third kind of weird nature that is just unique to Jesus. So he has this entirely different kind of nature, or a being that's just different from anything. But if you monophysitism, the monophysites, they were saying there's a one nature, one physis, so one being, one in Jesus. And the issue there again is you get a problem because you're either missing if you have only one, you're missing the humanity or you're missing the divinity somewhere, right? And the same with the monothelites. Their idea was that the will. So even the will, right? So they said, well, the will, Jesus' will was a divine will. Only one will. He only had one will, which was his divine will. What's the problem there? Whatever is not assumed is not redeemed. So he doesn't have a human will. That means the human will is not redeemed. So the church is just, it's interesting. If you look at these first ecumenical councils and the formulation of Christology, in essence, it's the safeguarding of salvation. And it's the safeguarding of this that was of the gravest concern to the bishops. And to say, no, and this is where then when you look at the tome of Leo, which is really the foundational document for the Council of Chalcedon, 451, which is really a lot more advanced Christological formulation. It was after centuries of battling these things out. So you look at, the tome of Leo was a letter that was sent from Pope Leo to Flavian of Constantinople, who is a patriarch, and it was explaining the position of the papacy. Now you had competing theological schools. Alexandria was one center of theological thought, and you also had Antioch, which is another center of. So you had different schools of theological debate, and like they were very robust, like generations of theologians who were teaching new generations, and very just like brilliant people. Or Origen in the school of Alexandria, I mean, remember Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, 700,000 scrolls. I mean, it was an intellectual powerhouse. And so you had, Cyril of Alexandria, you had Origen, you had Jerome was, studied then, in there, Jerusalem. There was a lot, the East especially. Rome was not known for its intellectual prowess. And really the tome of Leo that we read, nothing was really original there. There's nothing new in that writing. He was synthesizing and kind of, interestingly, he was kind of balancing these two schools, the Alexandrian school and the school in Antioch, and kind of balancing these two parties that were doing this, right, about Christology. But the Holy Spirit was involved in that. So the J.N.D. Kelly? He's a scholar of the early church, and he wrote a little summary of the tome of Leo, and he says, the Christology which appears in Leo's tome has no special originality. It reflects and codifies with masterly precision, that would be Roman, the ideas of his predecessors. The following are the chief points he was concerned to bring out. And there are 4 of them. First, the person of the God-man is identical with the divine Word. So, the eternal Word, when John says the Word became flesh, it's the real Word who becomes really flesh, right? As he expressed it, he who became man in the form of a servant is he who in the form of God created man. That's a cool sentence, huh? He who became man in the form of a servant is he who in the form of God created man. Though describing the Incarnation as self-emptying, he claimed that it involved no diminution of the Word's omnipotence. He descended from his throne in heaven, but he did not surrender his Father's glory. So you have that he's emphasizing the divinity, right? So he's saying this is truly God. Truly God. So then secondly, he said the divine and human natures coexist in this one person without mixture or confusion. Right? And you can see that in his writing. He's like, burp, 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 burp. Rather, in uniting to form one person, each retains its natural properties unimpaired, so that just as the form of God does not do away with the form of a servant, so the form of a servant does not diminish the form of God. Indeed, the redemption required that one and the same mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ, should be able to both die in respect of the one and not die in respect of the other. Right? In order to save us, Jesus had to be able to die and not die. Or else it's off. Thirdly, the natures are separate principles of operation, although they always act in concert with one another. So we have the famous sentence, each form accomplishes in concert with the other what is appropriate to it, the Word performing what belongs to the Word, and the flesh carrying out what belongs to the flesh. So what was human was perfectly human. What was divine, or is, I shouldn't say was, what is human is perfectly human. What's divine is perfectly divine. And they're like this. Human and divine in Jesus, one, but separate. Right? Lastly, The oneness of the person postulates the legitimacy of the communication of idioms. Idioms so that means of what we say about. So we can affirm, for example, that the Son of God was crucified and buried, and also that the Son of Man came down from heaven. Right? So you can say that whatever happens to Jesus happens to both his divinity and his humanity. So in Jesus, God brushed his teeth. Right? In Jesus, man cast out demons. Man rose from the dead. Man walked on water. In Jesus, God pulled up his pants. Right? So what you say about Jesus goes for his divinity and his humanity. Right? Because they are like this. But they're not mixed. So these four areas, he says, may not have probed the Christological problem very deeply. So believe it or not, that writing from the Tome of Leo is not very theologically sophisticated. In fact, he didn't really address some of the more complicated issues that the Greek theologians were arguing over. They had merit, however, in that they set out the factors demanding recognition fairly and squarely, as is. And moreover, they went a long way toward meeting the points of view of both the schools that were struggling for supremacy in the East. So the Antiochian school and the Alexandrian school, they were both fighting about it, and he was able, so the Antiochian school could recognize they could see their own theology in Leo's tome in terms of the affirmation of the duality in Christ and of the reality of the independence of the two natures, whereas the Alexandrians were able to see in the unity and the emphasis on the unity of the two natures working together. It's a very well-crafted letter, and it became really the foundation for the Council of Chalcedon's statement about Christ. So Chalcedon said, and this is very concise, this is Chalcedon, you can hear Leo's tome in it. Following the Holy Fathers, we unanimously teach and confess one and the same God, our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in divinity and perfect in humanity, the same truly God and truly man, composed of rational soul and body, consubstantial with the Father as to his divinity, and consubstantial with us as to his humanity. Like us in all things but sin, he was begotten from the Father before all ages, as to his divinity, and in these last days for us and for our salvation was born as to his humanity of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God. And we confess that one and the same Christ Lord, the only begotten Son, is to be acknowledged in two natures without confusion, change, division, or separation between the natures was never abolished by their union, but rather the character proper to each of the two natures was preserved as they came together in one person and one hypostasis. All right? There's some philosophical language in there, but you can understand, and hopefully I've been able to make the point that this is not just a bunch of theological, like arguing, they're arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin or whatever, as if this has no bearing. It has bearing. It's really important. The reason it's important is because of this. Because if you don't get this right, then you jeopardize the whole project. So hopefully you can, like, these clarifications, and they were essential. And they were made because they were actually being threatened by erroneous and false teaching that was cropping up at different times in different places. Okay. I want to just close with I'm going to close. But I wanted to close with, on December 20th in the Office of Readings, there's a beautiful, because this is all important, very important. But I also wanted to close with this beautiful reflection, Bernard of Clairvaux. It's from a homily in praise of the Virgin Mother, and he's talking about the Annunciation. So he writes, "Have you heard, O Virgin, that you will conceive and bear a son? Have you heard that it will not be by man but by the Holy Spirit? The angel awaits an answer. It is time for him to return to God who sent him. We too are waiting, O Lady, for your word of compassion. The sentence of condemnation weighs heavily upon us. The price of our salvation is offered to you. We shall be set free at once if you consent. In the eternal Word of God we came to be, and behold, we die. In your brief response, we are to be remade in order to be recalled to life. Tearful Adam and his sorrowing family begs this of you, O Virgin, in their exile from paradise. Abraham begs it. David begs it. All the other holy patriarchs, your ancestors, ask it of you as they dwell in the country of the shadow of death. This is what the whole earth waits for, prostrate at your feet. It is right in doing so, for on your word depends comfort for the wretched, ransom for the captive, freedom for the condemned, indeed, salvation for all the sons of Adam, the whole of your race. Answer quickly, O Virgin. Reply in haste to the angel, or rather through the angel to the Lord. Answer with a word. Receive the word of God. Speak your own word. Conceive the divine word. Breathe a passing word. Embrace the eternal word. Why do you delay? Why are you afraid? Believe, give, praise, and receive. Let humility be bold. Let modesty be confident. This is no time for virginal simplicity to forget prudence. In this matter alone, O prudent Virgin, do not fear to be presumptuous. Though modest silence is pleasing, dutiful speech is now more necessary. Open your heart to faith, O Blessed Virgin, your lips to praise, your womb to your Creator. See, the desired of all nations is at your door, knocking to enter. If he should pass by because of your delay, in sorrow you would begin to seek him afresh, the one whom your soul loves. Arise, hasten, open. Arise in faith, hasten in devotion, open in praise and thanksgiving. Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, she says. Be it done to me according to your word. It's a beautiful passage, huh? So, I didn't get into Our Lady much because we have a whole talk on her later. And I didn't get into the Trinity much because we have a whole talk on the Trinity later. So, but hopefully here we were able to catch a little bit of the mystery of the Incarnation. All right? So...